Hey guys, here we are for chapter 11, where we're going to talk about water. Today, section 1 are water resources. And here's your essential question. How would you describe the relationship between the groundwater and the surface water in a watershed? So, groundwater, surface water, watershed. Something to think about just as we move through today's lesson. Right off the bat, just water resources. Water is essential to life on Earth. No water, no life, at least not that we've ever found or come across. You can live for more than a month without food. If you're ever in that bizarre situation where you're trapped and alone and etc., don't worry about food. You have several days where it's not a big deal, but water you have to have. You can only live a few days without water. So find water, paramount importance. Now, obviously on the planet Earth, we have two types of water, broad. We have fresh water, the kind that you and I drink and need, and then we have salt water. So fresh water contains very little salt. It's not that there's no salts in it at all, but salt water has obviously higher concentrations of salinity, dissolved salts. Basically, any salt that winds up in fresh water makes its way down into the ocean, and then it stays there, because then the water evaporates, but that's pure water, and it rains, and the salts remain in the ocean, so it keeps getting a little saltier and a little saltier. Most humans use water. We have to use it for drinking, we have it for agriculture, lots of things that we require need the fresh water. Obviously, water is a renewable resource. It renews within our lifetime. Basically, every day the water cycle is going on. Now, I'm not going to harp too much on the water cycle because most of us are pretty good with it. But in essence, we have the water evaporates, the water rises as it cools off, it condenses. As it condenses, it forms into clouds, and eventually the condensation can be enough that the water precipitates and falls out of the cloud back to Earth in the form of either rain, sleet, snow, hail. Any kind of form that it comes out of the cloud is known as precipitation. And this is how you and I get our daily fresh water. It keeps evaporating from the oceans and falling into the mountains and the streams and refilling our water table. Now, 71% of the Earth's surface is covered in water. Of course, 97% of that is salt water. It is the oceans and the seas. Of the fresh water, so 97% salt, leaving 3% that's fresh. Well, of that 3%, so now we're just going to say 100% of the fresh water. Well, of the 100% of fresh water that's on the planet Earth, 77% of it is frozen in glaciers, and another 22% is groundwater up under the ground. So only a very small percentage, we're talking like 1% of the 100%. So we're talking about the total amount of water on the planet is way below 1%. It's like 0.0 something that actually winds up being fresh water available to you and me. Easy to get to fresh water. So it's a very small amount. This is just a graphic to kind of look at it. Salt water 97%, this tiny little slice, and of that tiny little slice, only a teeny tiny bit is really surface water easily available to you and I. The fresh water that most people use is coming from lakes and rivers, and also a very narrow zone beneath the Earth's surface. Like here in Florida, we tap into aquifers. We have aquifers, we have deep aquifers, and a lot of our water is trapped way down in these really deep aquifers that we don't really have easy access to. So we're talking about surface water, lakes, streams, rivers, the wetlands, and then we do have a little bit of water that's available to us in easy to reach aquifers. Surface water. This is the easy to get to, readily available supplies. All the bodies of fresh water. Now, technically, surface water is anything you can go and stick your toes in. So the ocean is surface water, right? It's on top of the surface. By and large, when we talk about surface water, we're really talking about like the streams and the lakes where we're getting fresh water from, but surface water on the surface of the planet. Now, the distribution of surface water has played a vital role in the development of human societies. Traditionally, we have built cities near surface water. You think about our big cities, New York on the Hudson River, Jacksonville right there on the St. Johns. You have quite a few cities along the Mississippi River, including New Orleans, Memphis, lots along there. Chicago on the Great Lakes. We can kind of go on and on and on. It hasn't been until recently we've only really had electricity that was cheap and available for everybody for, say 100 years, 150 at most. So we do have cities now where we can pull into aquifers and pump up, like Las Vegas, and we're in the desert where all the water's deep down. But once again, traditionally, we have relied on surface water, lakes and rivers predominantly, so that we can pull water off to grow crops, to get water to drink, everything that we actually need. So water has played a huge role in where we actually distribute everything. Now, I love this graphic back here. We have this drops of water. Now, two you can see pretty easily. Big ball. Now, if we take all the water in the oceans and put it into a ball, that's how big it is. Now, once again, this is three-dimensional, right? In the oceans, it's all really pretty shallow. So that's a sphere. So we look at that sphere is maybe 1,000 miles across, 1,600 kilometers, something like this. Well, it'd also be 1,600 kilometers high, so which is why. But once again, we take it all, we put it into one globe, and it fits inside of the United States. That little one beside it is the liquid fresh water. And there's another little teeny tiny one, we'll try and zoom into it, and that's the freshwater lakes and rivers. Yeah, when you look at it on that scale, it doesn't look like so much. Now, our river systems. Streams flow. We have a source zone. This is where the streams begin, typically up in the mountains where it rains and it runs off, but also, there's snow melt, etc. But typically the falling rain and it begins to form the streams. The streams flow downhill, they come in together to form rivers. And then a river system is a connection of rivers that drain a river basin, this whole area that slopes down into the low-lying area. Now, the largest river system in the world is the Amazon River. It drains an area of land equivalent to the size of Europe. Now, here in the United States, we're more familiar with this one, with the Mississippi. It drains an area that is going to be west of the Appalachian Mountains and east of the Rocky and the Olympic Mountains. And all of that water eventually feeds and drains into this Mississippi River basin. The Ohio River, the Missouri River, there's lots of different rivers that eventually make their way into the Mississippi and drains out. So this whole area is what we refer to as a river basin. And we would talk about Missouri River Basin, but once again, ultimately, since it all feeds into the Mississippi, it's one ginormous river basin flowing into this one area. This is what we call a watershed, the area of land that is drained by a water system. Now, the amount of water that enters a watershed throughout the year varies, right? We have seasonal rains. My dad would love to say April showers bring May flowers. It's not unusual for certain areas to have seasonal rainfall, so the rivers are full sometimes and lower in others. This is pretty typical. Also, we get snow melt in the spring. The snows up in these high mountains begins to melt and the water runs off, so the streams get higher, rivers get higher. And this can dramatically increase. Now, we weren't looking at it there, but some of the Colorado River, which snow melts on the other side, feeds much of California the water that they need. So sometimes the rivers are really high, and other times rivers can be reduced to virtually a trickle. The map up here, these are the main watersheds on the planet. And we can see, in certain areas, This is where they get, we can see the Mississippi River Basin there, right in the middle, up above in Canada, there's a couple. Down in South America, the largest one there, obviously the Amazon. We can look over into Africa, the Nile, kind of that top part of Africa, right near Saudi Arabia, the Nile River system. There's all kinds. But these are all of our various river systems and the watersheds that they drain into. So after we talk about watersheds, rivers, this is basically our surface waters. Of course, lakes are involved here. We're going to talk about groundwater. Most of the fresh water that is available for human use cannot really be seen. It's underground. Now here in Florida, we're familiar with this. It's our aquifers. As a kid growing up, I lived in South Carolina, and we talked a lot more about the watersheds because we lived at the foothills of the mountains and we lived in a watershed. Here in Florida, we talk about the aquifers because by and large, we are either pumping our water up out of the aquifer or it's literally bubbling up out of the springs. And a lot of our rivers around here, specifically the Santa Fe, very close to us here, gets our water from the spring-fed rivers. UF here in Florida, Gainesville made an agreement with UF that they could get free water from the nearby Bulware Springs. So since we had a springs local, we agreed that UF could get free water, and that was enough to entice them to build their university here instead of somewhere else. Water is a big issue. If you have easy available water, things are good. If water begins to dry up, your town dies. It's just the way it is. So, groundwater. It rains, rain hits the ground. Now, a lot of that winds up evaporating up. We get enough rains and it sinks down into the ground. And then we say what it does is it percolates through the soil. It slowly sinks down, down, down through the soil, and then it becomes our groundwater, the water that is beneath the Earth's surface. Once again, of all the fresh water, about 22% of it is actually groundwater. Now, as it begins to sink down through the soil and other things, it eventually reaches a level where the rocks in the soil are saturated with water. And this is our water table. Lakes are at the top of the water table. That's where the water table is. And at that level under the ground, there's water all under the ground that we can't see. We only see it at the lakes or a marsh or swamp, possibly. So in wet regions, the water table may be right near the Earth's surface, places where we have lakes. But it slopes down into the lake, and then the lake will dip down, and there's our water table. But it's that same level under the ground, if you will. But in some areas, the water table might be hundreds of meters beneath the Earth's surface, and somewhere like the desert, or say somewhere like Las Vegas, where they're pumping all their water out. There is underwater there running under this bedrock in a slow-moving river under the city, but it's not readily available. There are no lakes nearby because none of the areas get deep enough to reach the water table. Now, the water table has peaks and valleys that a lot of times match the shape of the ground above. Because what happened is the bedrock is doing this, and the soil above it a lot of times kind of mimics what the rock is doing underneath, because that's where the rock is sitting. It can't permeate below that, so we call that non-permeable rock. The water can't below it, and the water will flow along this rock just like a river. Sometimes it's slow moving because there's soil trapping it, but it's still running along through there. Aquifers. So the groundwater's down there, and we'll talk about aquifers. Now, this is a body or rock or some sediment that's storing groundwater, and it allows some flow of the water. Typically, these kind of open up into caves or channels, or at least it's very porous material, so the water's all in there and available. So the water table forms this upper boundary, and most aquifers contain materials such as rock, sand, gravel, but in some shape, form, or fashion, there's spaces, there's holes in this rock where water can gather. Now, groundwater will also dissolve the rock formations. Here in Florida, we have a lot of limestone. Now, limestone is soft, and you can see back here in this picture that you get these really vast caves, literally divers down there in the aquifers. So a lot of times the limestone will get carved out in certain areas. Now limestone will have lots of little holes here and there, and the rock itself is sort of permeable, but we'll also get these formations get carved out into these really big caves that allow us to access water. Looking at the picture here, this is just a generic, we see an urban area and a city. So where they're trying to show underneath, you can see that blue is the water table. It's not very deep underground in this particular area. So we drill wells down in. So we'll drill an open well, and then water will seep into that well and we can pump it out. You may be lucky enough to go into an area where there's already a big hole and the water's there, but otherwise you drill the well and the water from this water table seeps into that hole, and that's where we pump the water out. Cities will tend to dig deeper wells kind of to make sure they have more adequate water, and say like a homeowner or somebody with a farm, they may not drill a well as deep because it just costs money. The deeper you go, the more expensive it gets. So let's talk about this aquifer area. Two different terms we're going to talk about: porosity and permeability. Porosity, porous. It means something can flow through it. The percentage of the total volume of a rock that consists of open spaces. So something is porous, like a sponge is porous. It has pores in it, right? Little holes, little gaps. So water in an aquifer is stored in these pore spaces, these little holes, if you will. And a lot of times the water can flow from this pore to that pore. You know, if it's up here and the water goes down, it can flow down. Just depends. The more porous the rock is, the more water it can hold, meaning there's more gaps in it. Limestone is one of these great ones because it tends to be very porous. We also have the term permeability. This is the ability of rock or sediment to let fluids pass through it. You could have something with pores, but it could be trapped. The water is here, and I have water here, and the water cannot get from here to here. It's porous, but not permeable. We also have things that are porous and permeable. If you think about just gravel in there, well, it's porous, there's little gaps in it because the rocks are hitting and the water can fit in there. And it's also very permeable because the water can flow anywhere within this system. Materials such as gravel, they really allow water to flow and be very permeable. However, things like granite and clay are impermeable. So the bedrock is going to be up of granite or clay. Water can't sink through it, which is why we have a water table, otherwise it would keep on sinking down. But we have the water table. And sometimes you'll have an aquifer here and you'll have some sort of non-permeable material, clay or granite, between this aquifer and that aquifer. So I can pull water out of this aquifer and it goes dry. The water can't flow from this one into that one. If the material here was permeable, it would really be able to flow from one to the other. So porosity, the ability to hold water; permeability, the ability for water to move from one space into another. And this takes us to our recharge zones. Recharge zones are to aquifers as watersheds are to rivers. The recharge zone. This is where an aquifer gets recharged. The water, to reach an aquifer, the surface water must travel down through the soil, rock, etc. to get to the aquifer. Now, if the aquifer gets covered in something non-permeable, think a huge parking lot, well, the water can't get down. So if we build a city on top of an aquifer, well, we cut down the water footprint. Not as much water can actually now sink down into the ground. A lot of it gets channeled and runs off into the creeks and streams. Think about your neighborhood. You know, we put the road down and that water comes running down the road off into the drains out to the streams. It's not going into grass and sinking down into the aquifer. So in a lot of times, we had an area that was a big recharge zone, but by putting houses and buildings all over it, it becomes a smaller recharge zone. There's not as many permeable spaces. We've put layers of non-permeable rock on the top. So a recharge zone is just an area where the water travels downward to become part of an aquifer. So I have an aquifer down here, and I'll have a whole area up here where the water slowly sinks down into it. But over here, the water may just run off into a watershed, if you will, runs into a river. Recharge zones are environmentally sensitive areas. Any pollution that gets in the recharge zone makes its way down into the aquifer. And if the aquifer winds up getting polluted, it can take years or even centuries for it to get cleaned out. We would have to try and pump the entire aquifer out, try and fill it with more water. It's a very difficult process. When we looked at those Superfund sites in the beginning of the year, talking about these hazardous waste chemicals getting into the groundwater, this is what we're talking about. If they wind up polluting an aquifer, it can be we may just have to shut the aquifer down and we can't tap into it anymore. Back here we can see this idea of a recharge zone. Now this is showing two different aquifers. I have an aquifer over there near the mountains, kind of where the cloud is, and then I have another aquifer that's over closer to this lake system. And I have some non-permeable clay or rock in between them. So I have a large aquifer and a large aquifer, one's running deeper than another, but once again, different aquifers. So I have two different recharge zones. Area will refill one, and land area of another that fills the other. We talk about our recharge zones, it's for specific aquifers. Now the size of an aquifer's recharge zone is once again affected by the permeability of everything above it. So whether it's regular slate rock from a mountain or it's man-made, these affect the water seeping into our aquifers, which is why communities really need to manage our recharge zones. It can take a long time, even tens and thousands of years, to refill an aquifer. It's a slow process. When it rains, not all the water makes it all the way down. A lot of it's evaporating, and it's a slow process to sink through all these layers of sand and dirt to get all the way down into our aquifers. Now obviously the way we access the aquifers is by wells. We drill a hole down and the water leaks into it and we pump it out. Now we've dug wells to reach groundwater for thousands of years. And a lot of times we're having to use hand pumps, some way to get the water out. More recently, in the past 100 years or so, electricity has been available and reasonably cheap, and we use electric pumps to pull the water out now. But we've done it for thousands of years. We've known how to access them. And a lot of times we dig wells because the groundwater is a more reliable source of water. The rivers, creeks, and streams rise and sink, and lakes even rise and sink. Depending on where you live, if you're only nearby a small stream, it's big when the snow melts, but then in the wintertime it'll be really, really small. So a lot of times we've just relied on this groundwater because it's so accessible. The height of the water table also changes seasonally. If it's in the rainy season, the recharge zone the water table tends to creep up. We see this in our lakes. Lakes rise, lakes fall. So we have to drill down below, and typically cities will dig really deep wells. They're more well-funded than entire city taxpayer dollars, if you will. But we also talk about wells drying up. So if you're a farmer, you may not dig a really deep well, but if the water table sinks below your well, we say the well dried up, and then you would have to dig a deeper well. Now obviously, if we're pumping groundwater out faster than it can be recharged, then we drain an aquifer, and if it gets below all the wells, we either have to try and dig new wells or find another source of water, because it is definitely possible to pump water out faster than the aquifer can fill, and eventually the tank runs dry. Well, guys, that wraps it up for sources of water. Come back, we'll see you next time.